Have you ever lost your voice? I'm not talking about laryngitis here or the after effects of a particularly raucous karaoke night. I'm talking about that shrinking feeling when you lose all sense of who you are, your confidence, your way in the world. Well, I have, my friend. I think it's been a cocktail of a few things over the years. An exhausting, but not exhaustive combo of the shifting sands of identity, early motherhood, the ravaging of the beast that is perimenopause, social anxiety, masking, burnout, and let's not even mention the pandemic. I have become obsessed with this whole idea of finding your voice and what it means creatively, personally, and collectively when we find it. I want to understand how you find it, and if you've lost it, how do you get it back? Join me as I talk to fascinating people who have found their voices and aren't afraid to use them. People who have found their purpose, their passion, and fearless, authentic expression. I'm talking about writers, activists, artists, thinkers, entrepreneurs. We're going to get into their work and their life stories. How did they do it? What were the turning points? What barriers did they overcome? How did they find the courage? And what tips and tricks do they have to navigate this business of becoming? I'm looking to reclaim my voice, yes, and to get my mojo back, but it's more than that. I want to understand this topic and look at it from all angles: historical, cultural, societal, biological, mythical, even mystical. And most of all, through a female lens. Let's not beat about the bush, it's mostly women I'll be speaking to, with the occasional brilliant man thrown in. But these conversations are for anyone who resonates with the quest. Everybody's welcome. Hi, my name is Jessie. I'm a writer by trade, a novelist by aspiration. I do not have the answers, not yet. I'm not a certified coach with patented life theories or a high-flying CEO with productivity hacks. I am no guru, but what I am is endlessly curious about other people and their stories. I've programmed and run a literary and storytelling event series for over a decade now, so I know firsthand the power that stories have to inspire and transform, and that's what we're here for. So, if you want to find your voice or to be inspired, if you're in a liminal state, a similar boat, if you just really like books or want to feast on the sweeping stories of amazing people's life and work, then this podcast might be for you. Please follow, subscribe, and join me on this voyage into voice. And maybe, just maybe, we'll find ours along the way. Hello, and welcome to How You Find Your Voice. For this episode, my guest is the writer, essayist, and clinical arts therapist, Susanna Crossman, whose memoir, Home is Where We Start, is a searching, brilliantly written account of growing up in the fallout of the utopian dream. From the age of 6, Susanna lived in a politically radical community that set out to reinvent, well, everything, notably the concept of home and the family. In this conversation, we talk about what that kind of childhood does to a person, especially when the needs of the collective come before the individual, and when finding your voice means first unlearning the script you were given. We talk about masking, people-pleasing, and the long process of working out who you are when your childhood taught you to adapt, conform, and survive. We also talk about language, silence, and Susanna's deep interest in untold stories, including in her novel The Orange Notebooks, which explores grief, motherhood, and the struggle to find words for what feels almost impossible to say. This conversation was, perhaps somewhat appropriately, interrupted more than once, so you'll hear us pick up the thread again partway through. Maybe it's almost fitting for an episode about voice, silence, and the effort it can take to say what matters. I hope you enjoy it. Thank you so much for joining me.
Hi, Jessie.
Been really looking forward to our interview. I feel like a lot of the things that you write about, a lot of the work that you do seems to centre around this idea of finding your voice. You work as a clinical arts therapist. You've written essentially a finding your voice memoir, we could argue. I thought maybe we could start with your upbringing, because I feel like everyone's upbringing obviously impacts their voice and what they go on to do later. But yours was like quite an unusual upbringing in many ways. Would you be able to maybe set the context a little bit for anyone who isn't familiar with your work?
So I grew up essentially from about the age of 6. I grew up first of all in suburbia, and then my parents divorced, and my mum was a single mum in the late 70s and with 3 kids. And so she joined a lot of kind of consciousness raising groups, things like that, which were very sort of active and really interesting actually at that period of time. It all happened with photocopied sheets and you'd see little notices, there wasn't social media. And she decided to join a group of people who wanted to create a utopian commune. So they all kind of got together and have meetings. And we ended up moving to a manor house in the middle, a sort of crumbling 60 roomed with like 30 acres. And they wanted to remake the world. So reinvent everything from family structure, how we used space, how children were brought up, how women, gender roles, power organization, and it was all going to be reinvented. And so, even the architecture and how we sort of lived within this house. And unusually, because I think a lot of people have had, or a certain number of people have had experiences of like 1 or 2 years in that type of place, that's really the only childhood I've known. And I lived there from the age of 6 to the age of 21 or 20.
So like really your formative years, you really convey that in your book, Home is Where We Start. I'd never really thought about it before, kind of anything that I've read about utopias or, I mean, I don't want to call it a cult because you do define it as a community in your book, but I suppose would you say there's perhaps a little bit of crossover in some ways in the terms of
I
isolation?
think, yeah, it's very interesting because I think a lot of people, there is exactly, it's like a kind of Venn diagram, isn't it? There's things that cross over. I think what crosses over are living in a very secluded place with its own set of moral codes, its own language, its own value system, its system of relationships. What's different to a cult is the idea that you can't leave it, because obviously we could leave it
Yeah.
really easily and you can enter it relatively easily. There was a kind of process around entering the commune, and there wasn't a fixed leader because cults systematically center around a guru who often exploits, whereas this was a group of people. And
Yes.
also the value system, which is something I describe in the book, actually changed. So the community originally was quite Marxist, really feminist, and then as it kind of, there's a parallel with British politics, as the left softens, the community becomes, say, like in the 80s, much more involved around self-care, therapy, that kind of values, whereas at the beginning it was very clearly sort of Marxist, and then had sort of, there were hippies there, but there wasn't the soft left politics, whereas they came in later.
Yeah, that's so interesting you say that because there were a couple of things that really made me think that I'd never really thought about before I read your book. And one of them was what you just said, that you were there for very formative years from 6, whereas most people went in for, I don't know, like a short period of time. It was like an experiment. It really was your whole childhood, wasn't it? And I never really considered how these kind of experiments living, how they affect the children. That's not really, I mean, obviously I've read Lily Dunn's book as well, so that also made me
Yeah.
start about it. But it's such an interesting idea, isn't it? With the best of intentions, people are trying to, like you say, remake the world, but then in so doing, there are knock-on effects that they maybe can't foresee for the children in the second generation.
I think that was one of the major things in Home is Where We Start that I wanted to explore, because it was a very complex book to write. Because what's really complicated is the commune itself was run with feminist values, with left-wing values, which is things that I adhere to. So I don't come at it from a sort of rejection of the ethos. And so I think what it is very strongly looking at is the difference between intention and impact. And I think a lot, exactly what you say, when you look at a lot of these experiments, and it's an actual real thing. Ewan Morrison has written about this extensively as well around utopian experiments, is they're gorgeous for the adults in some ways. You go off, you kind of like out of the rat race, or, the treadmill, or whatever you want to call it, the grind. And you're suddenly in this place and you eat when you want and you can hang out with your friends. And and what's happening to the kids. They're all sort of running around together. What was really interesting with us is that very, very early on, so when we arrived in the commune as part of this kind of remaking, it was like we weren't allowed to call our parents mum and dad anymore. So I was just with my mum. And so I had to call her by her first name. And any problems, we had to be entirely autonomous. And so what happens a lot in these experiments, and literature has just shown this sort of systematically, is the kids basically get abandoned. It's boring looking after children. You know, there's a side, I say this being a mum of 3 children.
No, it's
but
true.
There's a side, of wiping noses, which isn't a kind of great utopian experiment. It's the sort of everyday grind. And if you look back even to utopian experiments, like the ones in America, which a lot of American poets and things were involved in, like Emerson and things like that, they basically, Brook Farm and places like that, they basically break down because people start having children and no one wants to look after them.
That's so interesting that you've identified that as like an actual point. It's like when the children come along, then you don't know, there are no sort of scripts with how to deal with them. People just actively don't want to have to, I suppose, engage with the mundane. I suppose if you're kind of interested in utopia and you're thinking about things sort of macro level, the kind of minutiae of like domestic drudgery is not going to be, I don't know, a motivating thing for you, I suppose.
Well, I think it does enter into a lot, but you have really interesting, like in a lot of utopian experiments, they abolish the kitchen, which is why I wrote a chapter about the kitchen, because I'm really fascinated by that kitchen, you know, there are these really interesting domestic spaces. And a lot of my memoir sort of looks at the different rooms and the architectures and how that all worked, because we all lived in these units. And so we were in these individual spaces. But, you know, as I write in the book, is a unit a home? Like which is where the title of the book comes from. But they deal with them, but they almost deal with them as though in this very mechanical way, you know, as though you could, if you just abolish a kitchen, whereas actually the hearth and the idea of cooking and eating together is really sort of a fundamental human cultural space. So there's whole experiments where they'll actually, but it's like an idealized version of, I think, a lot of utopian discourse, and a lot of it never refers to, which I find fascinating, anything to do with child development theory at all.
Which is obviously a real area of interest and expertise for you. I assume it was that your kind of interest in that area, I assume that was born out of your experience and your upbringing, in a sense, seeing what you lacked, perhaps.
I think actually, weirdly, I was so much at a certain moment in my life of denial of what I'd lacked.
Yeah.
It was as I began to read child development theory that I was like, oh my God, oh my God, oh my God.
It was like a penny dropping moment.
Oh, 100%. Because I grew up, and this is one of the really interesting things I found when I'd listened to some of your interviews, and the whole kind of idea of behind your podcast and finding your voice was that I'd grown up, I was interviewed for TV, press every single year. So I'd learnt this kind of script, which normalized my childhood, which is very much like being in a sect, I think. You know, it was like, we're normal, we're like everybody else. Yes, you know, you'd never mention the naked people. You'd never be mentioning that, you know, you didn't really see your mum in the week. You'd never be mentioning you were running around with all these kids that were bullying you, that you shared swimming costumes, you know. You're just like, my life is normal. It's all. And I just internalized all of that really until, and that's something I described in my memoir, until one of the last times I was interviewed. And my sister, who was much more sort of rebellious and critical of the commune than I was, turned around in this interview and just went, it was shit where we grew up, and we were being interviewed for the BBC. And I remember thinking, God, she's not towed the party line. Like, why is she saying that? And a friend of mine was like, but that's really normal that she said that. Do you not like what you've told me about your upbringing? And then I found it really complicated, because when people wanted to describe my upbringing as negative, they had images that I'd seen orgies or people shooting up heroin, and that didn't relate to my experience. And then on the other side, people would idealizing it like this fantasy, beautiful, bucolic thing where children ran around and, you know, people wore fairy crowns and stuff like that with flowers in their hair. And neither of those made sense to me. And actually, as I began to write the book, what made sense to me was how much my childhood was more like institutional and actually related to boarding school syndrome, which is being more and more recognized, and people who literature about prisons and about institutions. And, you know, paradoxically, I've spent a lot of my working life in hospitals and in psychiatric hospitals, which are closed institutions. And I think a lot of that literature suddenly kind of made sense to me as I was reading it. And I began to discover actually what my childhood had been about.
So it wasn't really until writing Home is Where We Start that you started to really engage with and unpack your childhood? Or was there an impetus before? I believe you wrote an essay, didn't you, that kind of, it was a precursor, shall we say? It's where the publishing interest came from.
Yeah, so I think it was a sort of gradual emerging through my clinical work, through, you know, talking with my sister, who always, as you know, it was almost this silent subject. And, you know, we never talked. My parents had left when my mum with her partner, they'd left when we were just in sort of early adulthood. I mean, it was like a silent subject in our house. Like no one talked, you know, we'd never talk about it, or it would come up and everyone would kind of freeze, you know, in that way people do around family secrets. And then we'd move over. And it was almost to say we'd never really lived there, or if it was mentioned, it was really nostalgic. And then my sister would ring me up and she'd be sort of saying, did that really happen? And do you remember when that happened? And you know, when we I don't know, say we would watch Harold and Maude, the film with loads of suicides in it, which is an idyllic film, but like we were like 6 and 8, and we'd be watching Tommy, you know, that film Tommy about.
I hadn't seen it, but I remember the part where you write about this in the book.
Yeah, and these things that we were watching in a Stephen Frears called Bloody Kids, and so we'd talk about all of these things, and so that was an emerging thing. And then, so back to the essay, yeah. So all of these things were emerging. Having my own children was a massive wake up call.
I was going to ask that actually. I imagine when you started writing the book, your daughters were probably around the age of you were when you started, I don't know, maybe experiencing the more negative sides.
They were kind of different. I've got big gaps between my kids. So there's like, I've got 3 daughters. So there's big gaps between them. But having kids was a wake up call. And basically I wrote this essay for Aeon and called The Utopian Machine, because I was really interested in the sort of machine-like side of my childhood, the institutional side, and the sort of slightly inhuman, like dehumanizing side. And it went viral. And I was so shocked because I remember, like, you know, I don't talk about that. When it came out the night before I went out to dinner with some friends of mine, and I was like, God, I've just written this essay, but you think of me tomorrow, and I don't think I'm ever going to write about my childhood again.
Is that because you felt very exposed?
Yeah, I felt really exposed. I'm quite, you know, it's paradoxical, but like a lot of memoir writers, I'm actually quite a private person. I'm not somebody who necessarily had talked about that a lot with people. And anyway, it came out, the essay went viral, and I immediately got contacted by all these editors who were like, are you going to write a book?
Love.
And I had a manuscript, and I'd already started writing. I mean, I've actually written about my childhood like a lot of writers, you know. I'd been writing on and off about it really since I was about 16 in different shapes and forms. And so that came out. And by the end of the year, so that came out in September 2022. And by December, I'd signed a contract with Fig Tree at Penguin to write the memoir. So it was like, you know.
Did you see it as a real sign, like a kind of a go ahead, like, okay, well, I have to do it because there's interest, it's the right time?
Yeah, but I thought about it a lot. I mean, I thought, I'm not just going to do it. I have to be ready to do this because it's a big story. And, you know, the book involves, you know, that there's some funny things in it, but there's also, you know, there's sexual abuse in it. There's quite a lot of trauma in it. So I did really think about it. And I remember talking to friends and you know, saying, what do you know, should I do this? And I'm thrilled I did.
Well, so am I. It's absolutely brilliant book. I was like looking through the prologue again last night because I read it a little while ago. And there's so much in the prologue. I think like you managed to set out so quickly without kind of over explaining to the reader. You allow the readers to kind of like pick up little hints and kind of suggestions that all isn't right in Utopia. You use the collective we a lot instead of I, which is very noticeable. And they're just these like little jarring details that come in. David, who's your best friend, you're 6 years old or 7 years old, and he's a fully grown man and an ex-heroin addict, and he says he's going to marry. You do such a good job of doing that dual narrative that Lily Dunn talks about, really giving the sense of what it was like to be a child in that environment, whilst also interweaving lots of historical and political context. How do you see your voice? Do you think you found your voice with this book, or do you think that it's like an ongoing process?
I think that it was with the essay that I felt like I'd really searched for so long to find a way, I guess, to talk about my childhood. And I wanted something that was sort of micro and macro. I really wanted this idea of and particularly because that was my childhood. It was all about the personal is political. So I wanted to be able to examine it in that sort of lens of that frame that came out of that sort of consciousness raising phrase that came out that, even the small details of your life are political, and to look at those paradoxes. So, yeah, I felt like it arrived in the essay. And then as I went into the book, it really felt very clear to me how I wanted to sort of interweave a lot of the things like a kind of lyrical narrative voice, because I wanted the reader to really have an experience, I guess, of how amazing it was. Because it was amazing. All of these people, and they'd come from all over the world, and there were people from America and people from South Africa, and there was this just extraordinary, like, as though this light was shining around us all, and we were perceived as these chosen ones as children. And then how really slowly all of that like really crumbled. And then, when you talk about the sect thing, I think just wanting to convey just quite how cut off we felt as children, because we were in this place with one language, one set of rules. And then for those of us who went to school, because not everybody did, but I did, you'd get into school and suddenly, we weren't very clean. We were in really bad clothes, and, you'd inevitably say the wrong thing, and then how people who entered into our world. So it was like finding the voice to convey all of that. It's a complex story. So, yeah, I guess I feel like I did find my voice in it, but it's a voice for this specific book. And I think that's the thing as a writer, is one's voice is always changing.
That's really interesting. Yeah, the voice is always changing in terms of the subject, I suppose. What you described there, it must have been quite stressful. I'm sure you must have been in fight or flight a lot, this kind of code switching, this masking. You do touch on masking, which I think really came out in your teenage years in the game that you and Claire, your sister, played when you were pretending to be other people and trying on different identities. But yeah, that must have been quite destabilizing for your sense of self to always have to be switching according to what environment you're in.
I think it's really exhausting. And it's funny, Moon Zappa published a book at the same time as Home is Where We Start. So her Earth to Moon came out, and we were linked together in the press and then became friends.
That's nice.
Yeah. And when we met one day at the British Library, and we were both in London for events, and we spent the day together. And one of the things we laughed the most about was about our capacity for masking, and how we'd grown up in these households. So she was like on TV with her dad. I would be in all of these situations, and how weirdly what happens is you sort of internalize masking so much that at a certain moment in your life, it's almost like a thing. Like it's lovely that you mentioned that game that Claire and I played, because it becomes like almost a challenge for us as we're teenagers. We'll just go anywhere, and we would literally just pretend to be other people, and we would find it so funny that people believe us, and we would just, we would pretend we were students, or we were always pretending we were older than we were, because, that's just a classic thing, isn't it? But I think where it's really damaging is, and this is what we talked with Moon about a lot, is finding who you are afterwards. So it's that whole capacity for masking. It gives you a certain skill about compartmentalizing. It means you're somebody who can switch quite easily, but it means your actual real self you don't actually discover in the way. And this is what Winnicott talks about, false self. Like children who grow up like that are real people pleasers. So they're really good at pretending to be other people. And, you know, it's like with the title of your series, How Do You Find Your Voice? That is a huge struggle, I think, when you grow up like that, because you don't know actually who you are.
I think one part that you wrote about that really exemplifies that is you're obviously an incredibly bright, curious, gifted child, and you had ambitions in some ways, like creative ambitions, or kind of wanting to put your voice or mark out there. And you write about how you were accepted into the grammar school, but you weren't allowed to go, even though you really wanted to, because the ethos of the community and how the we and the collective, or your personal needs, were always subsumed under the needs of the collective. I found that really interesting. How do you find your voice in that sort of collective, sort of commune environment? How do you go about finding yourself?
Yeah, it's really weird, that moment, and I'm glad, but I am glad. Like, so many people pick up on that as almost one of the saddest things in a book, and I think it, you know, because there's obviously things about sexual abuse and things like that, but there's a side where that is really, for me, like, it was such a sort of moment where I had to rationalize. I'd passed the 12 plus and I got into the local grammar school, and I'd sort of perceived that as a place, you know, like I was a huge reader from a really young age, and I'd read all these books, and, you know, the way bookish, nerdy kids kind of got on was you kind of went to one of these schools, and I'd sort of pictured myself in the uniform.
Tribe.
Yeah, it was my tribe. It was like I'd find my people, you know. And I didn't always fit in the commune because I was crap at sports. I couldn't beat people up. So I always got beaten up. You know, I'd fall out of a tree. And so, you know, this was going to be my chance. And I was the only kid in the school to pass the exam. And then I was told I wasn't allowed to go. And this collective, and it's like I just had to rationalize it. I just had to accept it. And I think it becomes really hard afterwards, as you develop, to sort of think, well, so how am I going to be myself? Like, where do I belong? Does that mean that when I want something, actually, I should just automatically put that second? And I think a moment for me, which is always really interesting when I do find a voice, is when I become like what I call a freak, or like a punk. And I wrote an article for Vogue about that. And I think that was such a sort of saving grace for me, that culture, because, you know, I shaved all my hair. I had like bleached blonde hair. I'd like wore like really thick makeup. And that was like a real rebellion within the commune context, because most of the women never ever wore makeup. You weren't supposed to dress up. And it allowed me to experiment with a really feminine side, which was also denied, because punk in itself is spiky, but it's very dressed up.
Yes.
And then a hard side simultaneously. So I think that was a real expression of myself, which was really empowering when I was a young woman. It was really, you know, I mean, I look back on that era and I wish I could still dress like that, to be quite honest. I loved it. Yeah, I know. But, well, it's more complicated as a therapist, actually, because there's a sort of more neutral sort of dress sense. And I live in France, which is very conservative.
Was that a bit of like, even though it unlocked yourself, it makes me think, not exactly costume, but it was a way in through a sort of wearing, well, I guess it's a tribal thing as well, isn't it? But I think about how actors often, in order to access their role, they might have to wear certain outfits. Do you think it was almost like that?
Oh, totally. Yeah, completely. It was like a sort of protective thing almost. Like, we were called freaks at school. That was the thing we were called in the 80s. So we were a bit like I'd seen a lot of punks in the commune, and I had a lot of friends who were punks. And I didn't know who to hang out with at school. You know, logically, bearing in mind my parents sort of, you know, they both came from middle class families. I should have been able to sort of hang out with the kind of girls who were kind of clever in the class and everything, but that just didn't work. I couldn't. Our life experiences were so different. So then I ended up dressing like that. And I actually ended up hanging out with most of the kids who then left school at 16, who were from really working class families. And we all got on like a house on fire at the back of the class with all of these, you know, all of these kids. And yeah, and I guess it gave me the space to experiment as a person and to still sort of exist as who I was.
Yeah.
Which is a really hard thing, like you say, with that collective we. It's so tyrannical. I mean, I read extensively about people growing up in the Soviet Union because it's so similar, and that collective we, how it quashes, you know, the same way you'll get from the extreme right wing as well. It's not necessarily just a extreme left wing thing, but it is really extraordinary when you grow up with a we, because you have a guilt about wanting anything for yourself, a huge guilt.
You mentioned that kind of the grammar school issue was a sadness, one of the sad things. There's one other sad thing that might not be what most people would pick up on, or maybe they would. I found the kind of description of when you entered, and you've already referenced it actually, the fact that you weren't allowed to call your mum anymore, the sort of like focused dismantling of the nuclear family. And now that you're a mother, how do you feel about that element of your upbringing?
So, yeah, so basically we were told that we were to call our parents by their first names. And again, as a kid, initially, it felt very privileged. It was kind of like, oh, I'm grown up now, you know.
Yeah.
You know, and you're sort of trying out your mum's name.
It's a cool thing to call your parents by their names, but I suppose it's with all the other stuff is taken away as well.
Yeah. And then I think there was this realization, which I sort of describe in the first sort of year of the commune, of suddenly realizing that there was no one there to defend you.
Yeah.
And then it's like this internalizing of this form of parentification, whereas actually you're putting your parents' needs kind of before yours.
Yes.
And I think when I look back now, I feel quite sort of sad about it, I guess, for us, like as a family, me seeing now, like what the sort of family I've built with my 3 daughters and with my partner, where, you know, I mean, we argue, you know, I'm not idolizing the nuclear family by any shape or form, or a heteronormative family or anything like that. But I think that any kind of chosen family group, there's this sort of intimacy from the amount of time you spend together and how you sort of build a sort of, you, through the shared experience and through a long experience and an amount of time, you sort of learn how to be a family together. And one of the things I describe in the book is that the only times we had together was eating on a Sunday evening and watching Upstairs, Downstairs.
Yeah.
And we'd eat baked potatoes. And I think what's quite hard is that afterwards, you just haven't probably spent enough time together to be able to then sort of get through the stuff that you get through as a family. And I think that's what I think people have to realize about when you go into those experimental things. There's sides of the place I grew up in. It's a bit like growing up in a station or an airport lounge. There's just always people passing through. So that's what you learn about relationships. You learn about how to deal with passing through relationships, but how do you learn about like really building these like really strong intimate relationships, which are difficult. They're not, you know, I'm not saying they're easy structures to build on, but I think that they're really, really important as a human being, and they really allow you to sort of learn about intimacy and closeness and things like that. And so, yeah, I think there's a feeling of sadness for me now, but maybe also for my mum, because I think that's not easy for her, actually.
Your mum obviously experienced incredible trauma, which I think was one of the catalysts for joining.
Yeah.
So I imagine she had quite a lot to, contend with, because you're in. Are you happy to talk about this?
Yeah. Yeah.
I feel like it is relevant also to the orange notebooks as well, because you were involved in a really tragic accident and very sadly your older sister died.
Yeah, so I talk about this in Home is Where We Start. When I was 4 months old, and at this point we were living in suburbia. My parents were married, and I had two elder sisters. So I had Claire and I had another sister, and we were going home from school for my eldest sister. And it was a completely freak accident. A wall fell on us. I mean, it's terrible. It's almost unimaginable, isn't it? Every time I say it, I kind of imagine that it happened. And so my eldest sister died, and Claire and I survived. And yeah, and then sort of a year or so later, I had a younger brother who was born, and then my dad left. So my mum the sort of series of events is really shocking. And particularly, and this is one of the things I really talk about a lot in the book, is how precarious life was for women at that time economically. You couldn't even necessarily have a bank account or get a mortgage. I mean, we can't quite imagine that. I remember my mum going to PTA meetings and she was the only one who wore trousers, and I'm not that old. And so yeah, so as a consequence of all of that, in a lot of ways, I admire her for her bravery, actually, in going and living at the commune at that time, because I think it was, she was looking for adventure. She was looking for a way to have us be a part of a supportive network, childcare. And I guess she thought, and this I think is mistaken, but she thought she was providing us with an opportunity as well.
Yeah, you can completely understand why she'd make that decision. It's all very well with the benefit of hindsight looking back, but I guess there weren't that many options available to her as a single mom. And the idea of being unburdened from domestic drudgery, sharing childcare, all sounds wonderful on paper, but I guess what you can't foresee is the kind of the lawlessness that you describe and the kind of complete lack of boundaries that kind of ensued. You talked earlier about how your sister was always more rebellious and you were more conformist within the community, and then outside of the community you were outwardly more rebellious and she was more conformist. How do you begin to rebel in such a boundaryless environment? It must have been quite difficult.
Yeah, she rebelled. She basically, when we moved there, so I was 6 and Claire was 8. So I think already she'd had more experience of life outside. So she just actively didn't like it, in the way that kids can. Like I see it, I'm sure you see it with your kids, I see it with mine. You'll take them somewhere and one of them will be like, "Don't like it, Mum.
I want to go home."
And so I think right from the beginning, Claire was like that. And then she, and I'll let readers discover that, but in the book I write, she very early when we went there, went to India very sadly and with quite tragic consequences. And I think all of that, she went to India on a trip, it was a real disaster with people from the commune. And I think she just could see it much more for what it was, whereas I think I was much younger and therefore I just internalized it more because I was, of an age where you just kind of go in and you kind of, I adhered to it. And I was quite a gregarious child and I was really curious, and I'm quite I still am like that. I'm quite a sort of believer, and I was reading, and it was a place as a creative child, which I am a really creative person. I trained as an actress, I work as a clinical arts therapist, I'm a writer. There was this whole sort of scope, there was a lot of creative things happening, and I think those things I was kind of adhering to. And then, like you say, what's really interesting is, so she was rebelling, I was adhering, and then outside, she, was much more straight-laced. At a certain age, she just became really like, right, I'm going to go, sort of normalise things. She worked in Dickens and Jones on a Saturday, wore a uniform and everything. I'd bleached all my hair blonde, had a nose ring at the age of 14. It was like, and so we sort of followed quite different paths as we were growing up.
Yeah. I think that I was just thinking about some of the themes in your writing in both of the books that I've read. And I'd say that silencing and sort of breaking silence, which I guess is a very much kind of a question of finding a voice, seems to be a really strong theme. What do you think draws you to voicing things that were unspeakable or silent or not addressed?
Yeah, I just think I find it so fascinating. I mean, I find it I find it so fascinating, all the untoldness of all of our lives. So obviously, you know, I grew up, and like we were talking earlier about the masking, I grew up in an environment where you just suddenly realize, even as a child, that you're telling one thing, you're living another. And, you know, at a certain moment in my life, I was quite conscious of that. And then I grew up, and that's something I write about in the Orange Notebooks, which is the story of a grieving mother. And I write about the kind of untoldness of grief, because I guess through the personal experience of having lived through, so, you know, what that was, again, was one of the things that kind of sparked me off writing Home is Where We Start, was when Claire died of cancer. She died of cancer when she was quite young. And it was almost like she wasn't there anymore. You know, it was like she was the only person. We were each other's witnesses of this story. And so that was kind of like telling my story and telling her story, but they're, you know, crossover points. And then the Orange Notebooks became, yeah, just writing about the parts of our lives that we don't talk about, but positive things as well. And it's something I find really fascinating when I'm working with patients, and just the extraordinary things as well that people do and that they don't talk about. I'm writing an essay at the moment. I've been interviewing Breton traditional faith healers who are called fire tamers.
Wow.
And they use traditional methods of healing. This has gone on for centuries. They're practically unheard of. And I'm just going to all these people's houses and learning about all these fire tamers. So I'm really interested in, I guess, the place in literature for the voices that aren't heard, the spaces where, you know, we whitewash, don't we?
Yeah.
So much, whether it's through the patriarchy, through colonialism. I'm reading, oh, I haven't got it next to me. The Decolonializing of the Body by Afua Hirsch at the moment. And again, it's just telling a different story, and also telling nuanced stories, I think.
Yes, not boiling things down to kind of the binaries, kind of the complexity of experience. I feel like linked to silence as well. One thing that really comes across in your work is your absolute love of language. There's a lot in both the Orange Notebooks and Home is Where We Start, where you really delve into kind of the etymology of words. And I get the sense of a mind that kind of really enjoys granular detail for words and grammar. Where do you think that comes from? And what do you think is the importance of language telling your story?
It's really interesting. I think it comes from being a huge reader, but I also think one of the things it comes from is from for people who speak several languages. So I work with a lot of mixed people from different cultures. I do a lot of work with communication seminars with people from all over the world. And I think there's this extraordinary sense, even if you look at a sentence, say something like, what does being on time mean? Like whether you're German, Japanese, Nigerian, Indian, French, you know, British, that won't actually mean the same thing. And I love that tradition of the practice of going back, which is, I think it's a Talmudic thing. They do it a lot in Talmudic scholars. They kind of go down and break down like the word to its origins. And I think it's just one of the ways we can look at what we mean when we're saying something. And I think it's Camus who said that naming something badly is like contributing to the world's disasters.
Yeah.
And I think it's so true, like the way we sort of brutalize language. I mean, when you look at fake news, when you look at even the reappropriation of a lot of therapy language, like the trigger or trauma, how simultaneously there's some good things about that because we've kind of made mental health language more accessible, but then simultaneously it's reappropriated. So actually people don't know what they're talking about when they talk about PTSD or about trauma. on a clinical level and what that actually means if for somebody who does have PTSD. And so I think
sort of flattens the meaning, because if it's ubiquitous and it isn't precise, then it's devalues what the original meaning is. Is that what you mean?
Yeah, and I feel like I train people as well in like public speaking, and so in using their voice. And one of the things I always say to people, because I get interviewed a lot, and I always say to people, like, we're really lucky to be given a voice. It's a precious thing when someone is there, even if you're presenting your thesis or your doctorate, like, you're only going to do it once, and it's a real gift. And there's so many situations in life when you're silenced and you're not allowed to speak. So when you're given that opportunity, use it, and use it precisely and with as much authenticity as you can.
At this point, we were interrupted for the first time, but we picked up the thread again, talking about the power of language and what it means to have a voice.
And I think we do live in an era where we've almost sort of forgotten this extraordinary power that we have with language, and also the opportunity that we have. It's such a privilege to be able to speak and to try and think about what we're trying to say with as much sort of authenticity and precision as possible. And this richness of language, and to really celebrate that when we're finding our voice, I think is a gift.
I agree. Also, in terms of language, finding the precise language and the way to express something allows you to kind of talk about the unsayable and the unthinkable, which is what we kind of touched on earlier. The Orange Notebooks, I don't feel like we've given enough airtime to that yet. What an amazing book. It absolutely wrecked me. Like, it was so moving. I spent sort of like most of a day just like weeping as I read it, because I just found the whole quest behind it so moving. And I think you write so empathetically. And I think, sort of going back to what we were just talking about, I feel like that whole book is an attempt by your character to kind of be able to find a way to express this, this awful tragedy. She's a grieving mother. She has lost her 6-year-old child who died. And I just found that really moving, her sort of working through trying to find the language to kind of voice it.
Yeah, I feel like it really links to this idea of silence that you were saying earlier, and like my books being about these kind of untold stories. And there's a thing I talk about in Home is Where We Start, which is there's a Greek myth around these people who are the makers of the universe, who are called I've written it down because I couldn't remember the Greek words. It's called an onomatogoras, which are the makers of the universe who create the laws, but they also name things. And I feel like in the Orange Notebooks, it's trying to name, and particularly name, that first year of the rawness of that grief. And obviously, this is an extreme grief. It's the grief of losing a child, and it's a tragic grief. But that first year of grief is such a strange moment in people's lives. And my partner and I went through a whole period between 2011 and 2014 where we sort of lost. My sister died, his mum died, his grandma died, 2 of our close friends died. It was a very strange period. And how much you learn actually in those periods when you kind of live through them. And that's what the main character in the Orange Notebooks is trying to do. She's trying to sort of grapple with this idea of she quotes Hannah Arendt at one point and says, how do you see hope in this moment where the whole world is suffering? And the idea of still throwing light through the cracks, all those kind of metaphors that we have, but which I think are such deeply human things, because a lot of us, most of us at some point in our lives are going to live through some form of grief, because we will, lose parents, grandparents, and, you know, hopefully not our children, but, you know, people who are our nearest and dearest. And I really wanted to give voice to that space, and also space to how human beings have always grappled with these questions. But we're now in an era where we want to kind of brush over and normalize, and, you know, particularly in our sort of Occidental, you know, a lot of Northern European, sort of North American society, where we'll be wanting it to be very, you know, neat and tidy. You know, someone will die, they'll get buried, you'll give a eulogy, and then it's slightly done and dusted and you move on. And more and more grief literature that's coming out is about how you have that first year. And then, you know, it's very unpredictable how grief works. But I feel like part of a grieving process, and that's what Anna is trying to do in the Orange Notebooks, is find the place where she can put her child. How is she understanding this loss? You know, it's completely unpredictable. So how is she going to understand it? But her specifically within her family history, her relationship with the child's father, her upbringing, where she grows up in a sort of Northwest London Jewish suburban upbringing, and how all of that, and her relationship with her husband's family, who are Basque and have death rituals, and all of that she's trying to understand.
Yeah, I love the kind of focus on colour throughout. Obviously, the title contains orange, but beige features quite a lot, and I'm with her. I'm with her in what kind of beige represents. There's too much beige in our world now, but yeah, it's part love letter to her child. It's part memoir, and also, again, you know, the philosophical threads running through. And yeah, I did find it deeply moving. There's magical realism in there as well. You know, the timeline intersperses between kind of then the meeting of the parents and kind of like how this child came about. I know it's not a memoir, but that I kind of that's
totally. No, because I'm interested in you saying it, because I think because I wrote a memoir before, I actually wrote this novel before I wrote Home is Where We Start. Yeah. And some people, I think, thought that this was partly autobiographical, whereas it's a completely fictional book.
I mean, I could talk to you sort of forever about kind of your writing, your process, but I guess one last question I would ask, you know, with all of your experience as a clinical arts therapist, all of your kind of writing and all of the work that you've done, what advice would you give to someone who is looking to find their voice? What have you learned?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I think finding your voice, there's a very strange mixture between listening very closely to your own intuition and what's kind of emerging when you're talking, and listening very closely to what feels right about what you want to say. And kind of, I mean, I work using a lot of brainstorming. I use a lot of mind maps. I use a lot of processes which will somehow break down the kind of rational barriers about when we're trying to find our voice. And I do that a lot with patients as well, because I think a lot of us have a narrative which we've learned when we want to talk about ourselves, through masking, through sort of the internalized dialogue that the outside world is projecting onto you about who you are. And I think trying to find ways to think about you as a unique person and what you want to say are very, very important. So that's an internal approach. And then I think reading as widely as possible and trying to understand as broadly as possible the environment that you're in. So that can be through art, visual art, through music. When I wrote Home is Where We Start, I researched extensively. Like, I looked at the newspaper archives from the period I was born in, and I looked at the Sun, the Mirror, the Guardian, women's press, Spare Rib, to try and have a very whole picture. So I think there's internal work to do, and I think there's external work to do. And I think that when you put those two together, it can allow something really unique. And I think, you know, your podcast is such a brilliant idea, because I think it's a long and quite deep process finding your voice. And yet when you do find it, it's so empowering and rich and important.
Thank you. And your voice is incredibly unique, and I'm really looking forward to anything else that you write. And thank you so much for speaking to me today.
I really loved talking to Susanna. One thing that really stayed with me is her interest in the untoldness of our lives. It's such a rich and fascinating area, the space between silence and voice, and this idea of untold stories seems to be a thread that really runs through her work, which is full of nuance and complexity. It's this emotional depth and fearlessness to explore the unsayable, which was why I was really keen to talk to her. And there was so much more I wanted to cover, but alas, we were derailed by life. The untold story of this episode is that I was recording in an Airbnb and had arranged a late checkout, which hadn't been communicated to the cleaners, whose knocking became increasingly insistent, which of course I totally understand, but it meant we ran out of time. I really wanted to ask Susanna about her extensive use of colour in the Orange Notebooks, to go into characterisation, the Basque death rituals, magical realism, the nautical themes, the psychiatric ward, but you'll just have to read it for yourself to experience it. But be prepared, it's deeply moving, and I really recommend it. If you enjoyed this episode, please share it, subscribe, or send it to someone who might find it meaningful. And if you'd like to hear about new episodes, gatherings, and live events, you can find the link to the How You Find Your Voice mailing list in the show notes. Thank you so much for listening.